All right, welcome into episode 55 of Happy Medium. I think this is the first back-to-back weeks of interviews that I've done, at least it feels like it. I have another guest that has thankfully agreed to join me today. If you follow Chicago sports or watch the news like Channel 9 at night and you want to see all the sports updates, you probably know who I'm talking about, maybe. A proud graduate of the University of Missouri, and like I said, a sports anchor and reporter for Channel 9 here in Chicago. Welcome on to Happy Medium, Josh Frydman. Josh, thank you so much for being able to come on with me, man. Appreciate it.
Yeah, Sam, thanks for the invite. Appreciate the intro as well. I would say people that are probably your age, young 20s, they might not be watching the news anymore. I think we understand that's not maybe the demo, but keep turning them into local news watchers. I think it's important. And if you don't want to watch the news, yes, you said it. We have a sports show every night, 10:30 on WGN called GN Sports. We also have a new digital show. Want to plug that as well? It's called The Sports Office. Starts at 7:30 each night. It's on our streaming app, so maybe a little bit more geared toward the younger folks on WGN Plus. So a lot of ways to see us for sure.
Yeah, for sure. I know I've been a big listener and watcher of Channel 9 Sports for seemingly as long as I've been interested in sports. So, speaking of that, that's actually how I like to start off all of my interview episodes with all my guests. So, Josh, I want to first start you off with your first interest or introduction to sports in general, whether you played anything or watched anything or just how you got into sports in general.
Yeah, Sam, I would say when I was, gosh, like probably 6, 7, maybe even like a little earlier than that. I always remember being into sports. My grandpa, in particular, was a big Cubs fan. So WGN comes in again here from an early age. I remember coming home from school and he would be sitting on our couch watching the 120 WGN Cubs game over the summers. It was pretty much a routine. And he got me first hooked on that team in particular. And I grew up in the 90s when obviously the Bulls were not only the talk of Chicago, but globally in all of sports. So, it was easy to be a basketball fan. The Blackhawks, we had partial season tickets, so we'd go to about 8 games a year. And then my dad, loved football, so we'd have the Bears games on every Sunday too. So I felt like I was surrounded by sports. My mom liked sports too, so it was pretty easy to get involved. I played t-ball at an early age, played baseball basically from when I was like 5 to 15, 16 years old. And dabble with other sports, soccer here and there, basketball here and there, volleyball in junior high. Played a lot of intramural sports, so I was always kind of a sports guy. Not the best athlete, but I was serviceable, I would say, kind of a utility player. So that was my first kind of introduction to sports, and I grew up a diehard Cubs fan, definitely because of my grandpa taking me to games in the mid '90s and watching games with him on WGN.
So, kind of going forward from your interest in sports, then wanting to pursue, a job and a life in the sports media field and world and broadcasting and all that, kind of how would you say your interest for sports broadcasting and media kind of started too?
Sure, I remember probably like eighth grade. I was at a sleepover at one of my best friends' houses. I'm still close with this day, named Lenny. And I remember distinctly we had like a conversation like, what do we want to do when we grow up? Like, what do you want to be? Like, kind of like, I don't know, just goofing off because we're 13, 14 years old. And I was like, I want to be the Cubs broadcaster. I want to be Pat Hughes. And I kind of like always in the back of my mind thought that would be the coolest thing. And so when we got to high school, I went to Stevenson High School in the north suburbs. And what was great about Stevenson, among other things, was just they had so many opportunities. They have 4,500 kids at the school, so you needed a lot of activities to keep everybody engaged. And so they had a radio station where you could join right away without signing up for any class, and you could be a part of the radio team. And so from my freshman year on, I was in the broadcast booth during football games, basketball games, baseball games for the Stevenson Patriots. And by the time I was a senior, I was a sports director. So I was able to call play-by-play, do color analysis for the games throughout the year. So not just, the fall football team, but like I said, basketball, baseball, hosted a sports radio talk show, and joined the newspaper as well when I was a sophomore, and did that junior and senior year, and was really proud of that as well. Was able to be a part of the Statesman newspaper, which won national awards. I was the copy editor my senior year. We had a great time. And so, kind of really to start high school, I was like, how do I get involved with journalism, sports journalism in particular? And I was lucky enough to have those opportunities at Stevenson. So yeah, that's where the bug kind of caught. I would say initially because I wanted to be the Cubs broadcaster, and then didn't do anything in TV until I got to college, which I'm sure we can talk about more. But yeah, in high school it was radio, it was newspaper. I thought I wanted to be either like a Sports Illustrated feature writer or a Cubs broadcaster.
So I know I touched on it earlier. Where you went to college, you went to the University of Missouri. So when you were, I guess, first, what made you want to go there for school? And then, did you have like a particular kind of route you thought you maybe wanted to take, whether it was like writing or broadcasting or anything specific, or were you just open to kind of doing like anything?
Yeah, good question. So because I was interested in journalism in high school, naturally I was looking for college choices that fit that mold, and didn't really know anything until about my senior year about Mizzou, which is the colloquial term from University of Missouri. My what ended up being my college roommate, who moved from St. Louis to our area, joined Stevenson around sophomore year. He was going to Mizzou, and two of my other friends, Lenny, who I mentioned earlier, ironically, was also going to go to Mizzou for journalism, and another friend of ours, Lee. So there was already three guys that were committed to Mizzou. My first option was actually Northwestern. I wanted to go there. Ended up getting on the wait list, and so I was like, all right, I think I'll push the chips in and go to Missouri. I have these friends that I'm really close with already going. I toured the school. It was close enough where it's like a 6.5 hour drive, so you can get there via car, but it's far enough away where your parents aren't going to come up the road and say hi, like DePaul or Northwestern. Nothing wrong with those choices, obviously, but I wanted to more that I thought about it, maybe be a little further away, kind of more independent. So yeah, that's kind of where Mizzou came in. It was always looked at as one of the top journalism schools in the country. The more I looked at it, it's the oldest journalism program in the country. 1908 was the year they opened their journalism school. So it had this prestige. It had the proximity that I needed. Where it was still like a Midwest school, but not Big Ten. It was a little different at the time. And yeah, so that's where I started. And I remember my first week, walking into both the student newspaper and the student TV station because I had a mentor that told me go look at it was called MUTV. Go look at the student TV station if I was interested in broadcasting. And like I said, I had no TV experience, but I was like, what can I do to start working here? And they're like, all right away, like let's get you involved. And you would go with a team of people and you start shooting high school soccer games, or I guess college soccer games in this case, or high school football on the weekends, and all these different things where I never picked up a camera besides like my video camera at home, goofing off with my brother doing home movies. So I had to learn how to shoot video, how to edit, how to do all these things, and obviously how to be on camera. So all these things were brand new to me, but I kind of fell for it right away. And I thought, like I said, I would do more radio and newspaper, but outside of like two or three newspaper articles, I kind of gave that up to do more TV work, and I would eventually do a little bit on the radio, but the TV path kind of consumed me. I really got involved, like I said, early, and there was so much to do there that you felt like you wanted to be involved. And eventually, my sophomore year, I was named the sports director of that student TV station. So by all the work I put in my freshman year and the involvements, they named me, the next kind of student director of the TV station, which opened the door for a lot of things. I was able to co-host a 30-minute show every week that we put on. That again, we hosted, wrote, produced, edited, you name it, and that was a lot of responsibility. Plus, I oversaw a staff of 50, 60 kids, and chose them for what they were going to do each week assignment wise, whether it was write a web story or go shoot the Mizzou gymnastics team meet. So it was a really great experience, and yeah, kind of was thrown right into it, learning by doing, and that was kind of what we call the Missouri method, where you really get that hands-on experience, and that's why I love the Mizzou experience.
So obviously, when we had our intro, I touched on your current role now, but I know that you've certainly had your stops prior to arriving back in the Chicagoland area. So, what were some of your initial roles, at least when you came out of college, and then how would you I guess, reflect on how your time in college prepared you for your roles after college.
Yeah, Mizzou prepared me immensely. I talked about the student TV station experience, which was great, but what really was key was at Missouri, they still do, they own and they operate the local NBC affiliate TV station. So just like NBC5 here in Chicago, that's owned by NBC Corporate, it's called an O&O, an owned and operated station. The affiliate NBC in Columbia, Missouri, which is market 140, so pretty low market, but it was run by the students in a sense. There were faculty members that were staffed and they were, paid full-time anchors, but the rest of the staff were students. And so when I was a freshman, I was able to go on Friday nights and be part of a 3 or 4 man team of students, boys and girls, who would go out and shoot high school football games maybe an hour away from Columbia, come back, edit it together, a 30-second highlight. And there was, maybe 15 games that got on that night because we had so many people, right? We had so many students that wanted to be a part of this. And the main sports director of the TV station called KOMU, he would put those highlights on the air and he would rely on all the students for the shot sheet, it's called. So basically who the players are, right? What happened on the play, and you'd write it out for them. And it was frenetic. It was crazy. It was a lot of fun. You're hustling. You're getting, like I said, you sometimes drive an hour away to get maybe 20 minutes of a football game, and you're driving back and you're putting it on the air for the live sportscast that night. And then what was really cool is they would have what they called the gold star of the night, which they awarded to what the best highlight was. So there was an incentive to get the best shots, to learn your craft pretty quickly and to be able to put the best highlight on the air and be creative. It really taught you to think differently, because if you just had a normal highlight, it really wasn't going to get noticed, but you wanted to think outside the box. So that was awesome. And then by the time I was a junior, I was anchoring sportscast on the local NBC affiliate. So I was basically working without getting paid for it at the NBC affiliate, and that was able to get me my first reps when I was 20 years old, 21 years old, and there was nothing really replaceable about that experience. And so I was able to do that my last 2 years. And so because I had that experience, I felt very ready for a job in another market. And I was able to get a job in Memphis, Tennessee, which is a top 50 market. And usually that doesn't happen right out of school. I was pretty lucky. It was at the time not full-time sports. It was kind of, I was doing a little bit of sports producing. I was reporting here and there. I was shooting the games, and I was filling in anchoring. I only got a few, opportunities in the beginning, but I was able to prove that I could do it. And yeah, I worked in Memphis for a year, my first year out of college. Didn't know anybody. Moved in with the weatherman who had been recently divorced, had a space in his house and was renting out his, like, it wasn't quite an attic, but it was like a den area above the kitchen. It was a little sketchy, but it was a house and it was $500 a month, which was all I can afford at the time. And that's where I lived for the first year I was there, the only year I was there. And, I was able to really dive in head first to the Memphis sports scene. They had the Grizzlies, obviously. So I was able to cover playoff basketball when I was fresh out of college, Memphis Tiger football and basketball, Ole Miss football. The SEC country is right there. The Redbirds, the AAA team, or the Cardinals AAA team. So there was a lot of really great sports opportunities there. And then that experience was able to parlay into a full-time anchoring job in a city called Cape Girardeau, Missouri, which is southeast Missouri, probably an hour and a half south of St. Louis. It's right on the Mississippi River and just southwest of Carbondale. So a lot of folks, Southern Illinois, they're more familiar with that. So that region where I covered a lot of high school sports, covered some stuff in St. Louis, including the World Series in 2013 with the Cardinals and the Red Sox. So that was 2+ years in Cape Girardeau, kind of what they call paying your dues, right? You're working in a smaller market. But again, I got a lot of, I was anchoring Saturdays and Sundays, multiple sportscasts a night. I was doing the Friday night football stuff on Fridays, basketball on Friday nights in the winter, doing feature stories, one-man band. So I was able to shoot my own video, edit my own video. You had a lot of autonomy. So you were able to really do a lot of things that you wanted to do, which was cool about it. But it was a lot more work because you were the person that was responsible for like 5 or 6 different jobs at once. But it really taught you to be able to manage your time, right? You had a lot of things to do for one day to get it all on the air. and you got good pretty quickly because you were able to just get a lot of reps in. And so, yeah, those are my stops before I got back to Chicago. And I was fortunate to get a job at WGN in 20 late. Actually, we're recording this October 22nd. October 23rd was my first day in 2014. So coming up on 11 years at WGN. And yeah, it's been great ever since.
Right. So, when when you were transitioning over to Channel 9, like were you surprised? Like, do you remember kind of what that process was like when you found out that, like if they offered you or if they just wanted you to be part of their team?
Yeah, so initially, the job opening that I signed up for at Channel 9 was for a sports producer. So what happened was I finished my 2 years in Cape Girardeau. They offered me to stay, and I was like, I don't know if I want to do another 2 year contract, lock in for another 2 years in this smaller mid-sized market. And my goal ultimately was always to get back to Chicago. And I networked a little bit with people I knew here. I found out this job was going to open up. I applied for it, interviewed for it, and they offered me. And I knew it was a step. It was a huge step up in terms of going to Chicago, but it was also I was going to be initially not on the air. So I was like, do I want to take that chance and risk never getting back on the air, which was obviously a possibility, or be happier going to a big market, being in Chicago, had a ton of friends that were back in Chicago in their mid 20s. You kind of have that FOMO, right? You were like, what am I missing out on that experience, being back in a big city. My parents at the time still lived in the suburbs. So I was like, I'm gonna take that chance and I'm gonna go back to Chicago. And so took that job at WGN as a sports producer. And what was the most, I wouldn't call it lucky. I mean, I think there's definitely luck part of it, but I'd say fortuitous um, opportunity happened in that winter. So maybe like 2 months after I started working, our news director put out like a blast email saying like, "Hey, we're gonna start to revive CLTV," which some people remember was our 24-hour news station that was in the WGN building 20 plus years ago. It used to be in I think Brookfield, so out in the suburbs. But since then, it was at WGN's headquarters, and it really wasn't doing anything besides like replaying the news on WGN. There was no original programming. So our news director at the time was like, I want to get a sports show back on the air. We used to have one back in the 90s called Sports Page. Viewers can phone in. There was a lot of like high school highlights, stuff like that. It was filling a niche that wasn't in the market anymore. And I was like, this sounds great. Like I immediately was like, I want to be involved anyway. Let me, here's some ideas I have for it, yada yada. And she's like, that's awesome. Thank you for the ideas. Like, we're looking for the on-air hosts. I know your experience. You have on-air opportunities. Like, I'm not making any promises to you, but like, send me your reel, your work, to see what you're capable of. Because reminding you, I wasn't hired to be on the air, so she didn't even look at my on-air stuff when they were hiring me for the producer role. They didn't really care about that experience, to be honest. So I sent them my demo reel that I had, and because I had the experience I did working in Columbia, working in Memphis, working in Cape Girardeau, they liked the work that I had done, and they wanted me to audition basically for this role. And they had Jarrett Payton in mind for the main analyst role, if you will. Jarrett, obviously Walter Payton's son, big name in Chicago, but hadn't done a lot of TV, and so they wanted someone to like be the number one, like be the driver of the show, if you will, be the pilot, and he could be the co-pilot. And so I was like, yeah, great, let's try it. So on Valentine's Day week of 2015, I remember that pretty clearly. We did a 30-minute test run. I wrote the whole show. I stacked like what was going to happen in the first block, second block, third block. I met Jarrett one other time before this, so he came in, didn't know me really before, like a brief 5-minute conversation maybe when he came in a couple months earlier to do like a guest spot for us. So we were really not even acquaintances at the time, pretty much strangers. And I was like, this is what I came up with, so let's just try it. And we immediately had chemistry, which was obviously super important. We were able to, click off each other, and we filmed this 30-minute show, and we didn't hear anything for 3 months. And then 3 months later in May, they were like, all right, we're going to green light the show. It's going to start in 3 weeks. And by the way, it's going to be an hour long, 5 nights a week, not a half hour. So it was like, come up with a name, figure out what you're going to do, but you're going to go on the air in June of 2015. Um, Obviously, an amazing opportunity, but it was like, all right, we got to get to work here. They hired a producer, Larry Howley from Indianapolis. So we started that show the day after my birthday, ironically, in 2015. I just turned 26. I had a TV show in Chicago. It was crazy. And we called it Sports Feed, kind of like a social feed, right? It was an hour long, like I said, Sunday through Thursday, 6 o'clock live on CLTV. It was awesome. We did that for 4.5 years, it turned out. So it was a really fun experience. We had a blast just kind of being a little bit more loose and conversational and taking chances because, to be frank, CLTV was not the most viewed channel. So I think people had to kind of find us that way, or we had to really, make it a priority to put things on social media to come seek us out. We did a great job. Larry, I'll give kudos to our producer for finding people to come as guests that had never been on TV before. Number of people, some now really in more high profile roles, were getting their first live TV experience on our show, which I thought was really special. And yeah, unfortunately, that ended in 2019 when we had a change of ownership and they decided to get rid of CLTV. But that was my first true opportunity in Chicago. And because I was on the air at CLTV within those 4 years, I was also, because I was still a WGN employee, able to fill in on the anchor side at WGN. I was able to host pre and post game shows for the Bulls, for the Cubs, the White Sox, the Blackhawks, which we all had games still on WGN. So it was an incredible opportunity. It was a huge break in my career, obviously, but for me, it was the getting your foot in the door, right? Being at WGN, if I wasn't already there, I don't think I would have gotten this opportunity. And having the experience of already being on the air and proving myself that I was able to combine those two things to kind of have the perfect storm. And I've been there, like I said, ever since.
So obviously you've been in Chicago for a pretty good amount of time now, but like, kind of like you were saying, you've also been in some smaller cities or markets that maybe not a lot of people have, known a ton about. So, what would you say are some, I don't want to say major, but just some differences in general between covering sports in a market like Chicago versus smaller ones that you've been at too?
Yeah, I would say the biggest difference is just the amount of people that care about the teams that you're focused on. Chicago is obviously a pro sports market, right? We have pro sports teams in every sport, and then you have the college level teams below that, and that's more even like I would say it's not even just like it's Northwestern because they're the local team or DePaul. It's Notre Dame or it's Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio State, Iowa. It's a Big Ten hub, so you have all these different fan bases. And then you have like the minor league teams, so like the Chicago Wolves, and you have the Chicago Dogs, which is a independent league team, the Schaumburg Flyers, and then you have the high school teams, which are amazing too. So you just have so many amazing athletes from the high school level up and even lower. I've done stories on middle school players that have gone on to perform for the national team in softball and things like that. So I just think there's so much more to get to and to do, and there's more people that are looking at your work, obviously, because it's a bigger market. When I was in Cape Girardeau, I was going to cover high school football games in front of like 200 people at a game, right? It was a small town stuff. I mean, they cared about it. It was like that was the thing to do on Friday nights, and they loved their high school sports. But there's a big difference covering high school sports in the middle of Southeast Missouri versus covering the Cubs in the playoffs and being in the locker room when the Cubs are clinching and pouring champagne on each other. So, those opportunities you get when you're in a smaller market, in a way, you're a big fish in a small pond. And in Chicago, it's the opposite, right? You have to really do things to stand out because there's so many ways for people to get their sports, not just from us local TV sportscasters, right? Which is kind of a little bit of an old school method. Now there's a million podcasts and there's websites that are strictly about one sport and one niche. It's like Bleacher Nation does a great job covering the Cubs, and they've branched out to now cover all the other Chicago sports teams. But they started as just a Cubs website. There's just like so many things to compete with now. And so you got to find ways to get viewers or get an audience to look at you and get to your station and your work and why that's important to, you know, why your voice is something that can stick out above the fray of everyone else that's also talking about the same thing, if that makes sense.
So I know you were just kind of touching on like you've at least in Chicago, I know you've done a ton of different stories. You've just covered a lot of different things. So when when you're like trying to tell someone's story or do a segment on whichever player or team, what would you say is like the biggest component to telling a good story or having a good segment?
That's a good question. So I think it varies. Like if you're doing a feature story, which I love going out into the community and talking to local athletes and coaches and telling stories that you're not going to find other places, right? I'm a sucker for those, heartfelt stories. Like the if you watch the CBS Evening News on Fridays, it's the last story. It's called On the Road. It's those stories that make you smile, make you happy because it's about the human experience. It's about perseverance. It's about courage. It's about the things that are beyond the box score, right? It's a little bit cliche to say that, but it's true. It's not just like who won and lost, but the people behind it. So that's what I try to focus on when I do these human interest stories. Is like, what is this person's experience like? Trying to tell that story and also doing it in a way that I think is creative. And when I say creative, I mentioned my writing background, having written in, high school for the newspaper and, always taking pride in that. I've carried that over to broadcasting. And I felt like my writing has been something that sticks out, whether it's writing a 20-second on camera intro to a highlight or whether it's writing a 2.5 minute feature story. I take um, a very immense amount of pride in crafting that story. I'm not just going to like put words together and throw it together in the last minute. Like I'm really taking my time thinking about how I can make this work in a fun, unique, creative way. And that takes some effort. I think some people in this business don't have that necessarily that I guess I would say that experience to do that. Like they're coming from a different path where they're just about, covering games or they're just focused on, reading highlights and scores. And to me, you can get that anywhere. So like where is the difference going to come from? So for me, it's like that's the creative voice. That's writing your highlights a little bit differently, throwing in stats that people don't expect to know or find out. It's all those things when you're working it in a highlight and when you're doing a feature story in particular, it's telling those stories that are unique and then, they really matter to those people, like those community members, whether it's a high school story or something about like the pro athlete's family, they're gonna remember that story for a long time because like it's personal to them. So you got to take like really important steps to make sure you don't mess that up, right? You have to be very respectful of them and their time because they're giving you the time to tell their story. And so I always take pride in that. So that's a big thing for me is worrying about the writing of the story, taking my time to make sure it's something that the people that I'm telling the story of are going to be proud of.
So kind of maybe more, or this question might be a little more personal to you, or just whoever I ask it to. But would you say that in your different stops, whether it's Chicago or not Chicago, would you say that there's been any sort of challenge that you've had to face?
Yeah, totally. Multiple challenges. I would say, when you're working in a small market, the challenge is sometimes the resources, right? You're doing like I remember distinctly, I would anchor a Sunday night sportscast that ended at 6 o'clock. I would hop in the car. I would drive an hour to go cover a Southern Illinois Saluki basketball game. And by covering it, I mean I would be there for 10 minutes. I would shoot half a quarter, get as many buckets as I could, get back in the car, race an hour back to the station. So by then it's like 8:30. My sportscast is at 9:40. I have to edit that video together. I have to write the rest of the sportscast. I'm producing the sportscast. And then I have to look good enough to be on the air and then anchor. So you're doing so many different roles. And in the time, it's just kind of like you just do it because there was no alternative, right? And now thinking back, because I've been at WGN for 10 plus years, 11 years, and in this market, you have a photographer to shoot the highlights, you have an editor to put it together, you have a producer. Like all those roles are separated. And so the challenge back then was to do it all. And there was a deadline. You had to be on the air, and and you had to do it by then. So that was the challenge. But it also made you really a much better broadcaster because you're able to understand all those roles. And then having our show at CLTV cut in 2019, having that all of a sudden just like end. And so I didn't know what the future was going to hold. And this was months before COVID. So like that was obviously who knew that was going to happen at the time. And it was all changing. Luckily, they wanted us to stay on and be part of the WGN Sports team. And we started GN Sports in January of 2020. So right after his sports feed ended, I was able to be a part of that show. And then COVID hits. So we're doing shows from home. That was a challenge. Like, how are you going to fill sports without sports happening? And we were able to do creative things. I remember my producer was like, go do a story on marble racing. I'm like, I don't know what that is. And they're like, there's a YouTube thing. People are like racing marbles and broadcasting it. And the guy that's broadcasting on this channel is a Cubs fan, apparently. And so I did the story. The story ended up on John Oliver's Last Week Tonight on HBO. They did not like the whole story, but they used part of our piece because they did a story on marble racing, ironically. So it's like you never know where things are going to go. And when I say like things that necessarily look bad in the moment or go wrong or are roadblocks, it just means that there are other things that are waiting for you in that next when the next door opens. Like really, that it is again cliche to say when one door closes another opens, but that is true. And things might in the moment look bleak, but if you believe in your work and your talents and your pursuit of this industry, like there are other opportunities for you if you go and you seek them out.
So I think we might have time for maybe one more. So kind of to tie this all back, kind of throughout all your different stops, whether it's Memphis or Chicago or in between two, would you say that there is a favorite piece or a favorite story that you've done that really kind of sticks with you?
Yeah, I've done a few that stick out. I'll give you one example. I know we only have a couple minutes left, but it was actually in Memphis, so my first job out of school. And in Memphis is the National Civil Rights Museum, and the Liberty Bowl is the bowl game in Memphis. And University of Cincinnati, was playing in the Liberty Bowl that winter, and they had a player named Ralph Abernathy, and I think he was the fourth, Ralph Abernathy the fourth, and his grandfather was Martin Luther King Jr.'s like right hand man, and because they were coming to Memphis for the bowl game, the whole family was going to come and do a tour of the National Civil Rights Museum. And so I contacted the University of Cincinnati. I was like, I want to be a part of this. Like, how can we make this work to do a story? And I was able to walk through the halls of the National Civil Rights Museum with Ralph Abernathy. I think it was the junior or the second. I forget the exact title, but it basically like Martin Luther King Jr.'s. It was the son of Martin Luther King Jr.'s right hand man. So it was at the time in the 60s, like he was just a little kid. But we saw pictures in the museum of him as a kid being carried on his dad's shoulders, walking next to Martin Luther King Jr. during the march, on Washington or in Selma. It was like crazy, this history. And um it was this mix of sports and history and obviously uh culture and tremendous events that happened in our nation. And that's what I felt like was powerful about it, because it was like it wasn't about sports, but it was this connection to sports because this family was in town for this game and the tradition of this name. And so that to me has always stuck out, and was able to, I thought, put together a pretty cool piece. And, just like be there shooting the video when they got to meet each other, the people at the museum with Ralph Abernathy's son. And so it was really cool. And that always sticks out to me as like a story I was pretty proud of.
Oh, yeah, I'm uh, I'm sure that that would be awesome. Getting to interview someone who's close to a very historical figure like that. So that sounds cool. Josh, thank you so much for being able to come on with me today. I know we only have a minute or two left, but it was really nice to be able to talk to you. And like I said, I've been watching you for a long time, so I really appreciate the time and your insight.
Well, I appreciate that, Sam. Thanks for being a viewer, and I appreciate you having me on the podcast.
Yeah, man, of course. Take care.
All right.